Let us get into the details of what India can do to prepare itself better for global trade wars. Join me to welcome the panelists on stage. Mr. Edgard Kagan, the Consul General. Edgard has been Consul General in Mumbai since August 2017 after serving as Deputy Chief of Mission in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia from 2014 to 2017. A member of the Senior Foreign Service, he worked previously as Deputy Director of the Washington office of the US Mission to the United Nations in New York. Let's put our hands together to welcome on stage Mr. Edgard Kagan. Thank you. Joining him is Ms. Rupa Naik, Senior Director, MVIRDC World Trade Center, Mumbai. Rupa Naik has vast experience in the field of international trade and has worked with a large number of overseas and Indian trade promotion organizations, spanning a career of over 27 years. Please put your hands together to welcome Ms. Rupa on stage. Joining them is Mr. Neeraj Gambhir. He has over 23 years of experience in India's financial sector. His expertise are in fixed income, foreign exchange, capital markets, structured finance, credit, derivatives, risk management, and investment banking. He has worked with large domestic and multinational banking and financial service organizations during his career. Let's hear it once again for Mr. Neeraj Gambhir. Joining them is Mr. Siddhartha Rastogi, Managing Director with Ambit Capital. He has 2 decades of financial service experience and heads Asset Management Division for Ambit Group. He's a visionary and forward-looking thinker, an avid reader and writer. His articles on finance and life are very popular on social media, I'm sure you know. Siddhartha is also an author of a book, 8-Minute Decision, which helps with effective decision-making. Interesting indeed. Welcome on stage, sir. Joining them is Mr. Vikal Kapoor, an international executive who has led the aggressive business growth of US and European private equity, family office, and F500 companies in technology, finance, and marketing. A serial entrepreneur groomed through the dynamism of Wall Street, Vikal has obtained a knack for rapidly benchmarking global management decisions against investor expectations to drive sophisticated client decision on investing US company equity, debt, derivatives, and everything in between. Let's hear it again for Mr. Kapoor. Moderating this distinguished panel is none other than Dr. Tulsi Jayakumar. She's a chairperson of Family Managed Business and a professor of economics at SPJIMR Institute of Management and Research, Mumbai. An alumnus of prestigious Delhi School of Economics, Dr. Jayakumar has a rich academic experience of 26 years. While you might know all this, what's interesting to know about her is that she writes extensively in the media and is a thought leader in the field of economics. Her press articles has been published in business dailies such as Economic Times, Mint, Financial Express, Hindu Business Line, and Free Press Journal. And magazines such as Business Today, Forbes, and Entrepreneur are also some of these esteemed national journals that she's written for. Like I said, it is a distinguished panel, and we can't wait to know how to strategize ourselves against the trade war. All yours, ma'am.
So good afternoon, one and all. It's indeed a pleasure and an honor to be moderating a panel which has some of the most erudite speakers in Mumbai and people who have traveled all the way from the US to be part of this panel as well. So welcome all of you, first and foremost. The topic for this panel is Global Trade Wars, Boon or Bane. Boon or Bane for whom? Boon or Bane for our target audience, which is the SMEs, of course. The IMF in January has pointed out that with the kind of rise in trade tensions between the US and China in particular, there is likely to be a decline in the global growth rate. They have put it down to 3.5% in 2019, 3.6% in 2020. We are seeing softer variants of this kind of Softer variants of the global trade wars would be the Brexit and the other kind of geopolitical developments. So the Economist has coined a phrase for this, which it has called slowbalization. Yeah. So we have all these multiple doomsday sayers and naysayers, while on the other hand, we had a UN report just 2 days back, which speaks about some of the countries which will actually benefit from the global trade wars. And India definitely is one among the 5 countries. India is likely to have an increase in the exports by about 3.5% on account of just the US-China trade tensions. So I'm going to start this panel with a question to Rupa. So Rupa, this 3.5% that the UN kind of says, and it looks glorious to us at this point of time because our exports have been declining. In the last decade, we've had almost a 10% fall in the exports. So as someone who heads the WTC in Mumbai, what is it that you would want to say on this? What are your comments? How do you think this increase in exports will play itself out? Do you think, A, would it happen? And would the SMEs be able to benefit out of it? What could be the challenges?
Thank you, Tulsi. Personally, I don't think it's going to benefit India in any way. First of all, we do not have the capacity. And where are our supply chains? No, I'm...
Pass the mic. It's not...
We do not even have the trade infrastructure. That's most important for India to even be competitive in exports. So I certainly don't think that there's any way that we could really benefit from this. If at all we benefit, we might benefit by probably exporting the lower end of the export, which could be raw materials, as India has always been doing that. So as far as India's participation in even the value chains is not as much as even other countries like maybe Thailand, Indonesia, and all the other countries in Asia. So if India has to really look at global markets, then India has to, the government has to put in trade infrastructure in place. The SMEs have to look at the competition which is happening to them, which is coming to them, it's because of technology. And they have to get in the best technology and try to bring down their cost of production to be in the international market today. At World Trade Center, we do try to bring in as many experts as possible to talk to the SMEs very often. And we find that every time we bring them there to talk to our members, they are very content with the domestic market because India is not an export-driven country. So to be suddenly told that there is this huge potential for you to export to, it is, of course, a great possibility, but we do not have those kind of capacities, the economies of scale which China enjoys. And today China is there in almost every part of the world. So even if they are slapped with this kind of tariff, I'm sure they'll find a way to still export from some other country where they are having some regional tie-ups. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupa. Mr. Kagan, I come to you. So I'm going to start with asking you a very benign question, which probably is there on the minds of everyone out here, that, in fact, one of my students had written into me because I'd said, if you have any questions to ask, you may. Now, in India, there is a saying that when 2 elephants fight, the only thing which suffers is the grass. So the benign question to you is, what happens when the 2 elephants fight? What happens to a country like India?
I think, there's a couple of things that are worth keeping in mind. I think one is the term trade wars is a bit of a misnomer. Obviously, it's gotten a huge amount of media attention, and it's got sort of a nice zing to it. But I think that it's worth noting that what is quite striking is that if you look at the last 2 years, when the sort of trade wars have come in as, I think, linked to the Trump administration, President Trump's policies, what's remarkable is there's been a relatively minimal impact on actual patterns of global trade. And I think that the significance of that is that it's important to look at what really happens as compared to what people say will happen. When I was growing up, my father had in his office, he had a poster that said, when all is said and done, more will be said than done. And I think that what's important to look at is what's actually been done. And I think the significance of that is that, we're seeing a U.S. administration that is representing views that's very frustrated with how global trade, and particularly many bilateral trading relationships, have worked. And with trying to come up with an approach to deal with the lack of progress on the implied premise that drove many of the global trade agreements that the U.S. is party to, which was that the U.S. would open first. And the U.S., as I'm sure all of you know, remains the most open major global economy. The average applied tariff in the U.S. is 3.4%, and the U.S. is assessed by the World Bank as having the lowest rate of non-tariff barriers of any major economy. The average applied tariff that Japan has is around 5%, the EU 5.8%, China 9.4%, and India 13.8%. And I think the significance of that is that even with the changes that the administration has announced, two things have happened. One, war sort of presumes both sides will fight. In fact, in almost every major case, the other parties have come to the table and moved forward on changes which have been useful. I think for a country like India, the significance of that is, first of all, there is an opportunity. And, we can argue about the numbers and the UN report, but I think the real opportunity is strategic, which is that many global multinational investors are trying to rebalance from China. That, regardless of the right or the wrong, regardless of what's really going to happen, I think many of them are realizing that they are very heavily exposed in China and want to try and rebalance. India, in many ways, is a logical place to go, and there's an opportunity to be seized by a country which is willing to put in the right policy frameworks and the right policy settings to encourage investment, and particularly to be part of global supply chains and global value chains. I think that that's where the real opportunity lies, is that as countries are looking about where they're going to do business, and multinationals are looking about where to do business, I think that India stands out because it has the potential of having already a large domestic market, but very clearly a lot of global growth will be here. So I think that that's where the opportunities are. I think the question is, will India seize those opportunities by putting in policy frameworks that allow India to be integrated increasingly into global supply chains, and at the same time continue and improve its attractiveness to investment?
Sure, thanks, Mr. Kagan. I think the whole question of rebalancing away from China, I was just talking to one of our esteemed guests here, Mr. Arun Gupta, who's joined us. He was a panelist last year. He was just telling me about how he does business with China and with some of the other countries as well. And he was talking about how China, which has never ever offered credit to the Indian parties, is now talking, though in hushed whispers, about possibly extending the credit lines. So I suppose there is fear on that side as well, that there is a real possibility of rebalancing away from China. But my next question to Siddhartha here is that we do know that trade is as much strategic as it is economic. And Barack Obama had spoken about the TPP. He was looking at it as an attempt at balancing American commitment to the international liberal trade order while excluding China from the fruits of such an order. But given that the US administration, the current US administration has withdrawn from the TPP, how should India look at this kind of development?
So thanks for the interesting question. Before we understand this question, we have to delve back into the history. Why the TPP came into existence and what is the origin of these trade wars? We have been talking about trade wars. What is the origin of it? So the first two lines which everybody should understand, and it's crystal clear. Economics drive politics. Politics does not drive economics. Go back 1950, after the Second World War. US contributed 50% of the total world's GDP. Very, very powerful, massive. They wanted to control their supremacy. They came out with WTO. At the same time, as the luck would have it, lot of nations were getting independence. whether African, whether Asian, from the European powers, from the British. And they needed support in terms of industrial revolution, which has hit Britishers in 17th and 18th century and then migrated to US in the 19th century. There were only three challenges which US could foresee: Germany, Japan, and the third one, China was never in the picture. So Germany, Japan, both were neutralized. The third one, Russia, is going to be neutralized by the end of the century. World Trade Organization is formulated. The dominance of the Western world continues on the Eastern world. Luckily, ASEAN come into picture. So Southeast nations form a small coterie for a free trade association, 1967. China pushes its growth through controlling agriculture. Huge famine, 10 years lost. US in the meantime continues to grow rapidly, massively. The best years in the US history, 60s, 70s, 80s. All of a sudden, there is China who crops up. Now China is manufacturing more than US. Keep in mind, never in the history, these three powers or so-called threats have ever exceeded 66% of the total industrial production. So Russia, Japan, and Germany put together never exceeded US's production to the extent of 66%. 84, US tries to consolidate its backyard. NAFTA is organized. Mexico, Canada, US. 21% of the total world's GDP, 1/3 of the total trade across the globe. 93, President Clinton signs the treaty. 10 years, phenomenal growth. 2000, President Clinton's regime, US reports second lowest unemployment in the history, 3.6%. US GDP grows north of 4%. US wage inflation north of 4%. Little fast forward, 2008 happens, unfortunate. President Obama takes over. Crumbling corporate world, crumbling corporate profits of US, no sight. He proposes TPP, massive move. 40% of the total world GDP will come under TPP. The only challenge is China, India, and Brazil are excluded from here. So the idea is, when President Obama came back, President Bush had this theory to be out of Asia. But President Obama said, return to Asia. Nobody listened. He said, rebalance Asia. People listened. And 12 countries were tried to move into TPP. The only one clause which created a lot of challenges was investor state dispute settlement, which means if any of the companies which are investing in these free trade zones, and if the state objects because of a strike, or if there is a strike, or if there is loss of production, the state has to fulfill. Unfortunately, that falls out. President Trump, on the third day of election, he says, I am withdrawing. 1 year hence, President Trump is saying, give me a better deal. I am open to looking at TPP. These are all official data. You can go on Google, you can go on Twitter, you can find everything out. So what is the learning from all this? Why am I telling you this history? Very, very simple. For every country, there is a single reason why they enter into trade pacts. Not because not because they want to do so much of welfare for the people. It's because the politicians are under pressure from the people to ensure that there are things which are given at a level playing field. And hence, they balance it out. And these trade associations, so as soon as TPP was formed, there was regional comprehensive economic partnership which was formulated under the leadership of China. Now, why, as soon as there will be one block, there will be multiple other blocks. So the learning from this entire thing is simple. India holds a great opportunity because India's expertise in the services has always been superior. So India is one of the few countries, India and Sri Lanka, which have skipped the industrial revolution altogether. From agriculture, they are straight moving into services. Now that's the area if India is able to capture, because these two elephants, as Tulsi mentioned, then definitely India and Indian SMEs can benefit out of it.
So thanks for that historical perspective. I had a question for Mr. Kagan on that, but I'll come back to that later. My question now would be to Neeraj. Neeraj, your expertise is on the financial side, and we've been talking about the trade wars in terms of the goods and the services, but there is going to be a secondary impact of these trade wars on capital flows. And India has been, has enjoyed a capital account surplus for all these years, and that's in fact one of the ways in which we've been able to manage our current account deficit to a very large extent. So if the capital flows dry up on account of the various fallouts of the global trade wars, how does this affect the availability of liquidity in the economy? And in particular, for the SMEs, which already face a shortage or a cash crunch, how does this really affect if the financial sector goes into a further kind of a tizzy?
Thanks, Professor Jayakumar, for inviting me. So, from a financial market standpoint, what I would say is that there is a lot of talk. There's a lot of concern of around what is going to happen between US and China. But as Mr. Kagan pointed out, there's a lot of talk, but nothing has really happened. So the reality is that we are all trying to understand how this threat is actually going to play out. It hasn't yet really played out. How it is going to get played out. What is going to be the longer term implication of increased protectionism on both sides, and not just between US and China. I just want to point out that if you look at India versus US, right, though Mr. Kagan said that it's a good opportunity for India, I'm a little concerned that we are the 9th largest trading partner of US. We have a total of about $28 billion of trade surplus with US, right? And if you are going down the chain, at some point in time you're going to question that. We saw one news item appear yesterday which said that about $5.6 billion worth of imports out of India, which are subject to a generalized system of preferences, may be affected by increased tariff. So I think we are all trying to understand what it means. The reality is that we are a capital scarce country. The reality is that we need a lot of foreign direct investment, and we need a lot of foreign portfolio investment into our markets. FDI doesn't just bridge our current account deficit, it also helps us bring in technology. Earlier Rupa talked about that we are not there in the value chain. Our SMEs are not investing. The reality is that our SMEs are actually fighting day to day for survival in a very hostile business environment, right? FDI is an important source for us to import that intellectual capital, yes, which will help us compete in the world trade order. So, if as a result of these trade wars, we see that the ability of global multinational corporations to invest in countries like India is affected, FDI flows across the world are going to be impacted, right? I don't know if you noticed that yesterday or day before yesterday there was a news item about Walmart and Flipkart, right?
Yes.
Though it's got denied by the CEO, but the concerns remain. And the markets, when they deal with such concerns, the markets are always very, very, very edgy, right? If, whether or not these concerns really play out, but if it feels like that, $30 billion worth of foreign direct investments, another $20 to $30 billion worth of foreign portfolio inflows that we get every year are going under pressure as a result of these trade wars, the first casualty will be our exchange rate, right? And while for the exporting SMEs this may be a good news that rupee is going to depreciate, but reality is that historically SMEs have had poor understanding of what happens to the exchange rate, right?
Yes.
And the exchange rate implication of them has been a lot higher. So I think the first thing that probably comes to mind is that we will probably have a lot more currency market volatility, and we need to be prepared to deal with that volatility, right, in our setups. The second thing is that, as I said, the import of capital doesn't mean just the import of capital, it also means import of technology, imports of intellectual capacity, and if that gets impacted, our competitiveness going forward will get impacted, right? So, like I said, hasn't really materialized. We are all seeing how it plays out, but that's the threat.
Sure. So that gives a good way to seg into the next kind of a question with Vikal, which is on technology itself, right? So as Neeraj rightly pointed out, maybe the SMEs are not open to the kind of threat that the capital market volatility or the financial market volatility is going to have on their businesses. But what about technology itself? The next trade wars, I think, are going to be less played out on the grounds of, the economic grounds than on the technology grounds. So how do you really cope with the disruptive influence of AI, of big data? How can SMEs cope with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Oh, I guess I'll take it. That's a great question. But before I make the leap to a solution like AI or big data, I think there's a couple of things that we should set some groundwork on. When I look at SMEs globally, having run them, funded them, and also now inserting technology in them, SMEs are by and large underinvested in technology because they look at technology as a cost center, not as a profit center. And if you look at Indian SMEs and where they land on that matrix, they're extremely underinvested. The reasons why, my panelists know better than I do. But fundamentally, as we've advanced in India to skipping the Industrial Revolution, moving to services, in the rest of the world has moved to digital, and it's quickly moving to adopting the 5G ecosystem. So what does that mean for your business? So if you think of knowing your customer, if you look at your balance sheet, you look at your P&L statement, you actually have to be able to predict what your customer wants, and your customer could be a B2B. Not only predict it, but get it from your supply chain via procurement, have the working capital to be healthy enough so that you actually can procure it, but also have a margin in your trade cycle. And all of this holistic thinking really is improved by data and analytics. How many of you here have advanced to cloud? How many of you still using ERP? The challenge is the Fortune 1000s around the world are using all of these technologies. It leaves the SMEs out of the game. In Silicon Valley, if we look at the capital flows there, we never invest in a services company. We ask the pitch, is this a services or product company? Services is like they're off the stage. Are you a product company? Great. How do you gain traction and how do you scale? Because SMEs like yourselves are going to have to be able to open up your laptop, log into a website, and run your HR, run your accounting. And the next level of that is to say, how do I do better HR? How do I protect my customer data? How do I analyze using LinkedIn who I should be hiring? So groups that previously were 5 FTE rapidly move to 3 FTE. It saddens me that I see IIT, IIM, top engineers hired into Fortune 500 companies in India, into the back offices. Unbeknownst to them, there's a digital transformation project happening in New York that is going to wipe out their job in 6 to 8 quarters. That is happening faster than I've ever seen it in my 20-year career, having been in capital markets, private equity, and in VC, because of the ubiquitousness of systems of intelligence. So a quick primer, a system of record is where you put your data. A system of engagement is how you interact with that data. CRM systems, for example. System of intelligence is analyzing all of that without you having to own a data center, without you having to have the ERP built in, and you just get the answers. An example is the newest hedge funds in the United States, they have no data science team. They just run everything on algos that they outsource. That's, in fact, what's called data light. That's called tech and analytical heavy. SMEs, fundamentally, if you had to start your company all over again tomorrow, you had to hand it to the next generation of succession, that's what you should be focused on. You should be focused on how do I innovate to a level where all of this becomes net operating margin, or in essence, net operating revenues. Let's not worry about FX rate volatility. Everything will take care of itself. All these products exist. But fundamentally, you should look at your company and say, I have a tech company that delivers widgets around the world. I have a tech company that does services for HR. I have a tech company that does events management. And that shift in thinking will help you rapidly start to learn and adopt the solutions that, in my humble opinion, are going to allow you to survive, but also allow you to succeed, because everybody's coming to the #1 market over the next 12 years, and that's India. At a 7.5% growth rate, compounded, that's pretty impressive. We have 3.5% in the US at best. China's slowing down. I think it's overrated. The digital war is a real war. That's the one that I think you have to win.
So I think, Vikal, I'll kind of ask you to continue on that bit, just to shed light on, yes, technology is going to be the big game changer in that sense, but how expensive is technology adoption going to be for the SMEs? And if you're looking at wars of a certain kind, not the trade wars, but wars which are technology driven, how do you look at adopting technology which makes sense to the SMEs? Because, I mean, here is a bunch of hard-nosed businessmen. Yeah. If they could have adopted it, they would have adopted it long back. And maybe awareness is something which is not there, but probably one also needs to understand what is the cost and what's the benefit of it.
In my humble opinion, I suggest you hire somebody extremely young that grew up around just being very digital. That's the first thing. I learn a lot from everybody young I hire. They won't pay $20 for a shirt, but they'll pay $20 for a salad. It's a totally different shift of customer thinking that we're not used to. They never give out their phone number. They give it a VoIP number. They never give out their personal data. It's a complete shift in thinking that we're not used to. We grew up with like dial-up modems and looking at the shift. They were like, I always protect my data. Yeah, there's a digital profile, which is not my real profile. And then I have my real profile, which I know. So the first thing I tell you to do is like learn from the young. They know what's up. The second thing I'll tell you to do is to know that the forces of price commodity of technology is in your favor. For example, you can be on AWS. It's actually much cheaper now than it was 5 years ago, much cheaper than it was 10 years ago. The cloud has allowed you to like shift everything to monthly revenues that you can actually see in perpetuity and forecast for better with your CFO or your financing heads. The third thing I'll tell you is not only you're able to see that the technology costs are actually going down, but you actually could start to look at these systems of intelligence. Like, how do you go out there and look for a better supply chain order management system? You may see it as like an OpEx that you can't afford initially, but if you were to interpolate it to say, how much additional hours do I get back on a weekly basis? How much less auditing do I have to go through at the end of the year? You start to look at your business in a way of like, wow, I have gained the most valuable asset, which is not on my balance sheet, which is time. And that's more face time with your customers. That's more face time knowing what the competition's doing. And fundamentally, your competition will look at you in a way like, hey, you know what? Maybe I should consider partnering with them. Maybe competition is, and co-opetition is more of the conversation.
Sure, thanks, Vikal. Going back to Mr. Kagan, Siddhartha gave a beautiful historical kind of walkthrough of how the global world order really evolved. But the question that I had for you is, if one were to look at it historically, China's introduction into the international liberal order was thanks to US, in fact, even into the WTO. So what do you make out of this new changed relations, A? And with every country trying to adopt protectionism, is it RIP free trade? Is it RIP WTO?
I think, you raised a very good point about the U.S.-China relationship. I first started working on U.S.-China relations in 1996 and worked on the China desk in 2000 to 2002 and was in Beijing from then until 2007. And much of my subsequent career working in Australia, managing U.S.-Japan relations and U.S.-China or U.S.-Korea relations and then in Malaysia where I worked on TPP and here has really been about China. I think that the number one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that the global order has also received tremendous benefits from China's role. And before that, it's also worth remembering that the U.S. played a very similar role by opening up its markets in the development of Europe, Western Europe, as well as Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia. Almost all these countries had their key elements of their growth came from the ability to export to a comparatively very open U.S. market. And you can see that India has benefited as well from the ability to export to the U.S. And as was said, the U.S.-India trade relationship is one that has India's largest trade surplus, both on goods as well as on services. And so this has been a very positive force. So I think in terms of China, the way I think about it is that there have been tremendous benefits from China's growing integration into the global trade order. There are obviously costs as well. I think the real question right now for us is that we've been working for a number of years, and TPP was very much part of this. Remember, TPP, the countries participating in TPP were not chosen by the United States. The countries participating in TPP chose themselves by being willing to be part of a high standard, very comprehensive trade agreement, and many of the countries that were mentioned, Brazil, China, India, were not willing to do that. There were others, Indonesia and Thailand, that were not willing to do that, though subsequently they started to have some second thoughts. I think that the real question right now is, like, China's growth has very clearly had significant global impact, some for the good, some not for the good. I think we want to see is a change in the type of the model, one that many Chinese economists believe will be very good for China in the longer term. I mean, what is striking is that many of the changes that the U.S. is advocating for in terms of a more transparent economy, less government intervention, less sort of targeting of certain sectors by the government are things that Chinese economists have supported for many years, and that much of China's growth came from relaxing those things. So I think the question is going to be, where do we go now? I think it's very clear. We're having very serious negotiations. I've been part of many trade negotiations, and they're always tough. And I don't want to prejudge what's going to happen, but I think that the outcome is going to be that you're going to see, in my view, a rebalancing of the U.S.-China trade relationship that will create opportunities, and at the same time that will also, I think, address concerns other countries have. I mean, I think it's fair to say the U.S. is not the only country that has concerns about China's trade practices and how China has tried to manage its trade. The U.S. is the only country that's really trying to do something about it, but this is not new if you look at the global order in the last 50 or 60 years. So I think that what we see are opportunities. I think the changes that we were talking about are things that also create tremendous opportunities to try and move to a more open system. And it is very clear, the countries that are going to benefit are going to be those that take advantage of these opportunities, that try and open themselves up, that try and ensure that they are able to be part of global value chains. The U.S. has been doing that and benefiting from that for years. Obviously, we feel that there has been some loss of momentum in that, and that's why we're going with a different approach. And I think that we'll see. I think that if China now finally starts to fully live up to the commitments it made to get into the WTO, that is something that will create huge opportunities for the U.S., but also for India and other developing countries.
Thank you. Neeraj, question to you. So going back to the capital flows bit, How do you think India's central bank, RBI, is prepared for that? Just yesterday we saw just a 0.25% drop in the rate.
So clearly, I think the concerns on growth, partly because of the global growth concerns arising from trade wars, and partly our own internal dynamics. I think that's playing out in terms of looser monetary policy. Now, beyond that, whether India has taken any specific steps to take advantage, especially in the financial services space, to take advantage of what's going on in the global arena, I don't think so. In fact, as Mr. Kagan pointed out about China's lack of openness, I just wanted to highlight that, relatively speaking, Indian financial system today is a lot more open financial system for the foreign direct investment compared to China. I mean, in my previous organization, which was a Japanese investment bank, it tried very hard to gain a certain level of exposure to China, partly because they were Japanese, there was issues, but also because China is not really open.
Right.
Relatively speaking, India, and I don't see Mr. Padmanabhan here, he was the earlier executive director of RBI,
Yes.
he would bear this, that India is actually a very open economy as far as financial services is concerned.
Sure.
And a large number of global players have actually come and set shop here.
Right.
And they have, especially American players, they've set shop here, and they are pretty, I don't think they have this same level of access in China. So clearly there is an advantage. And as they say that the capital follows the real sector. So if more investments flow into countries like India as a result of this, then certainly I feel the financial sector will also benefit from it. But I won't say that we are doing anything specific in terms of policies to benefit
Absolutely.
per se.
I think that's something which
That's something which we need to really think
Yes.
through. I don't know if Gift City is one such idea. It never took off in a way. But now I believe that they're trying to have a unified regulator in Gift City, because our idea of Gift City was that in a way it was our form of winning back our business, which was being conducted in Singapore and Hong Kong and Dubai.
Right.
A lot of capital which is coming to India is getting managed by Indians sitting in Singapore, Dubai,
Yes.
Hong Kong. And why not have the same business being done here out of India so that we generate employment in India and sort of benefit from that. So I guess, but that's not really taken off, but things like that could potentially help us in terms of getting some of that value back onshore.
Thanks. So Siddhartha, I think he mentioned one word, E, the employment word, which is kind of reigning supreme at this point of time. And you spoke about how we're going to kind of lose the race to the rest of the world because of the service-dominated economy, which other countries are, as opposed to India, where we are service-dominated, but maybe lesser so than South Korea or China or some of these other countries. So a couple of quick questions. One is that, do you really see the kind of services that India is specializing in as what the world really wants or what the world really needs? Because we are into software, whereas the market is for business and commercial services, A. And B, if you have a service-dominated economy, I think what happens to manufacturing and what happens to agriculture? So that question.
So for your first question, today also the entire so if anybody is aware of the fund administration, fund management services, which is at the back end, all the hedge funds, and Neeraj and a lot of you guys would be aware. All the hedge funds and the largest administrators' back office is controlled entirely out of Vashi or somewhere in Navi Mumbai or in Andheri East. Entirely. And this I'm talking about the top 6 global administrators based out of Singapore, based out of US, all parts. So that's one. Second is, if you look at artificial intelligence, which Vikal spoke about, Fractal is one of the companies which is specializing in artificial intelligence. But there again, the backend and the R&D and the research entirely is happening in India. So I clearly see that services play in India is gonna remain very, very dominated for next 10, 15, 20 years. And it's not by chance that India dropped manufacturing. So remember that post-independence, the large population went into agriculture. Unfortunately, the industrialization beyond government intervention never picked up in India. However, services, because of the entrepreneurial zeal, Indians have natural inclination to it. And that is the reason in India, we never saw an expansion of a hand phone, which is table phone. Whilst straight from nowhere, we have migrated to a smartphone. And smartphone is doing business everywhere. Now, this is an intelligent thing which SMEs especially need to do first. They have to figure out how can they operate, barring their customers from one room, being minimalistic. So currently, most SMEs still believe layers, the CFO, the chief of HR. In all global technology companies, the chief of marketing and the chief of servicing is the same guy. And he looks at his computer and he knows what's happening. Because we all have studied in our B school that cost of acquisition of a fresh client is 5x as compared to our existing clients. But in India, what happens is your existing clients keep leaving you because of a better opportunity and you are not able to service. So to answer your first question, services will remain dominant. For your second question, what happens to the manufacturing and agriculture? In the Western world, we have seen that in employment. Unfortunately, there are no answers. We have seen a lot of political slugfest because of this particular issue of employment. Unfortunately, we are still not realizing that manufacturing cannot create so many employment opportunities. Still, most of the government policies are only focused on creating manufacturing jobs. However, this has to do because of the education system particularly, because India mostly adopted the education system from the Industrial Revolution, which happened in the British era. Now, we continue with that system. So engineers come out for manufacturing. However, as Vikal said, how many engineers are actually doing services? And that's the key area. How many people are getting trained for animation, are getting trained for so many other services? Now, until as government policy gets aligned to that services as a sector, it's unfortunate that for next 3-5 years, we have to live with this political slugfest.
Sure, thanks. Rupa, one last question from my side, and then we'll throw it open to the audience for a couple of quick questions. How can WTC help our alumni, our SMEs at this juncture?
First of all, let me just tell you that World Trade Center is not a chamber of commerce or an industry association. The concept of World Trade Center actually came up in the US, New York, and the founder of this was Mr. Guy Tozzoli, who started the World Trade Center Association, and he started building on the World Trade Center, which provides all kinds of trade infrastructure for SMEs, right from an office space to a business center, to venues for hosting your events, to understanding the latest business trends, having banks located in the World Trade Center, having trade organizations located in the World Trade Center. So that's how the World Trade Center Mumbai came up in the 70s. And World Trade Center Mumbai is a part of a huge global network, which is actually unparalleled in the world. If you look at it, there are 330 World Trade Centers across 90 countries today. And together, about 1 million business houses come together through these World Trade Centers. So World Trade Center Mumbai, as we said, as I told you, we have a lot of dialogue with experts who come from different countries, even from India, policymakers, academicians, and also business leaders. And we have this continuous dialogue with them. We do advocacy and we also help them to find trade partners. We identify trade partners. There's an Argentina president coming and there's a huge delegation coming. So we have been one of the organizations that the consulate has asked us to identify trade partners for these 40 trade delegates who are coming from the agro sector mainly. So that's our...
So what should they be doing is my question. Should they be
Please connect with
become,
the,
part
please
of
connect
the
with the
WTC?
World Trade Center.
Yeah.
We are not a membership-driven organization.
Okay.
We do not ask you to become a member. We just ask you to follow us and to make sure that you know what's happening in the world. And we'll connect you to any part of the world wherever you want to be through our representatives in other World Trade
And
Centers.
that's pro bono.
Yes, absolutely. Pro
All right.
bono, no problem.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Some quick questions from the audience, please. Yes, I can see your hand going up. Just introduce yourself and then ask your question. Let the question be a question and not a statement or a long-drawn one.
Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Pranay Surana. We manufacture steel wire products based out of Hyderabad. My question is initially when we were discussing about the challenges, the opportunity which India has because of these trade wars, but we don't have the policies in place to develop the volumes or to develop the skills so that we can take on these volumes. So what are the policies that we do not have in place, and which of these policies is the need of the hour?
So can we ask Rupa to kind of elaborate on that?
It's actually not the policy. It's the infrastructure. We do not have the capacity. We do not have those kind of economies of scale that China enjoys today. And we are also not mature enough to be a part of the global value chain. All these value chains have become very mature today. So we are not a part of that value chain. So to reach there, of course, we need a lot of government intervention, but also engagement from the industry with international players, which is lacking. One very important thing, which Vikal said, is that we need to adopt technologies. But how do we adopt these technologies? We need to travel overseas and to see for ourselves how other countries are grappling with the competition that they are facing. And what are they doing? Just don't do B2B meetings. Make sure that you visit their factories. Make sure you visit and go see their labor force, how they work. There'll hardly be any huge labor force. It's all done through technology. So
no, but my question also is probably, do we have the kind of trade promotion boards that
we
some
do
of
not
the
have
other
a trade
countries
promotion
have?
organization. This is one very important thing.
One important thing.
India doesn't have a TPO. Every other country in the world has a trade promotion organization. Look at pro-Brazil, pro-China, or not, it's not called pro-China, it's called CCPIT. There is COTRA, there is JETRO, there is pro-Argentina, there is pro-Chile. Across the world, every country has a trade promotion organization. The trade promotion organization is located internationally in every country, and they promote the SMEs and they bring the business to the SMEs within their country. This is a study which World Trade Center made and even submitted to the Ministry of Commerce. The Ministry of Commerce agreed and they said, yes, we are probably proposing to have a TPO. But it's still not yet happened. This is one policy measure which is most essential for Indian SMEs and for the government if it seriously wants to look at enhancing its exports and footprints in other global markets.
Let me just make a small point. The majority of the growth in the US was based upon government expenditures. It's actually something that's not talked about. But now with technology, you should not wait for the government. You should absolutely go out and do whatever you need to do to succeed. And one of the key things an SME can do is actually vertical integration. Look at who your supplier is, look at where procurement is coming from, and source that, and then look for those tighter partnerships. That's like a very key next step. That could be with technology, and it can also be not with technology. But vertical integration is something that all SMEs should be constantly thinking about.
Okay. Another question, please, and that would be the last question of this particular panel. I can see one hand going up there, yeah.
Hi, I'm Saurabh. I'm from FMB 10. My question is to Vikal. I think what you said really made a lot of sense, and even in my town, I come from Indore, and we see a lot of disruption that technology is bringing in. What I would like to know from you is technology changes so fast. What are the baby steps or the initial steps that FMB firms can take up which help us to embrace technology?
I'll give that to you.
Yeah, because I'd asked him and he said that it would be like a primer. So probably you can connect outside. Yeah, Professor Nitin. But maybe do you want to say a couple of quick steps or no, you better do it later.
I'll do it outside. They both got questions.
Okay, my name is Nitin Gadiyar and I'm faculty at SPJIMR. My question is for Edgard. The enemy's enemy is your friend. And China is our probably our common enemy in the trade wars or so-called trade war. What specific suggestions would you have, maybe 2 or 3, to the Ministry of Commerce, the Government of India, and to your own administration, to look at areas of cooperation where 2 large players can actually meet up and counterbalance the menace of the common enemy?
Thank you. I think it's a question that we'd like to get because I think it does point to the fact that there's tremendous potential for strengthening the U.S.-India trade relationship. I think that from our standpoint, a couple of things. I mean, one is to avoid retrograde progress. In other words, I think some of the actions we've seen in the past year have been troubling in terms of the imposition of tariffs into areas where there have been tariffs before, changes in tariff structures, also in e-commerce and data localization. Some of the steps, in our view, call into question the premise that India has really been one of the greatest beneficiaries from the global flow of data, and that it's something where taking steps to restrict that lead to unpredictable consequences, particularly if other countries were to follow suit. So I think that where we would like to see progress is, number one, to reduce some of the trade barriers that are points of friction in the relationship, in the U.S.-India trade relationship. We've had ongoing trade discussions with the Ministry of Commerce for some time. We would love to see progress in that, which I think would make it much easier to continue expanding the relationship. We'd also like to see freer flows of investment going in both directions. That's been an area of strength. I think that some of the uncertainties that have cropped up in India are calling that into question a little bit. And so that's something that in our view should be addressed. And in particular, to avoid actions which A, are done without consultation, and B, which call into question some of the investment decisions the companies have made based on assurances that they've received from the Indian government. I think that also on our part, we continue to welcome Indian investment into the U.S. We continue to benefit and see tremendous potential for growth in Indian exports to the U.S. And that's something we'd like to continue doing, and in our view, the best way to do that is for the market in India to become more open, which will make it easier for American companies to come here because they will be able to have some confidence of the ability to continue to source part of their supply chain from other places. So in our view, these things will help take advantage of the synergies. At the same time, it would be useful for India, I think, to be a little bit more forthright in its public statements, in international fora, and in trade fora about its views on this. And that's true for a lot of countries. I mean, look, I can tell you privately, most countries around the world are pretty supportive of what the U.S. is doing vis-a-vis China on trade. Very, very few are willing to take any kind of a public stance. And I think that there's something that's worth thinking about, is that most countries hope that there is a positive result from what the U.S. is doing on trade with China. At the same time, if they're not willing to step up and be part of this, it does make it harder for us. Also, it makes it less likely that they will benefit. I mean, frankly, changes which are purely bilateral between the U.S. and China run the risk of leaving other countries out. So we would love to see more of that with respect to India. And I think I can't stress enough the importance of policy consistency, both in terms of the bilateral relationship and government to government, but also in terms of attracting business.
I think that's a great note to end on. Policy consistency is the need of the hour, I think, from every country. And the takeaways for all of us, Siddhartha. Okay, you'll speak later, okay, because we're already running 15 minutes late, yeah. So I think the takeaways are basically for the SMEs, there is an opportunity, but the opportunity will depend on whether or not we are able to kind of bridge the technological gap, whether we are able to get our finances, our financials right, and the vertical integration that the speakers spoke about, try and focus on the sectors where the highest opportunities are, and I think we could still kind of see some silver linings in the cloud. And thank you, all of you. It's been a wonderful panel, and it's been a great morning and a good afternoon. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Edgard Kagan, Mr. Siddhartha Rastogi, Mr. Vikal Kapoor, Mr. Neeraj Gambhir, Ms. Rupa Naik, and Dr. Tulsi for moderating this panel discussion so well. I think you totally encouraged the answers to every question that could have crossed our mind when it comes to global trade wars. Thank you so much. And Mr. Kapoor, if I may say, what stays with me as an entrepreneur is the fact that I am a tech company which is into coaching. A round of applause to all our panelists, please. Thank you. May I now request Ronak Shah and Kinnari Gosrani, our alumni, to please come on stage and felicitate the speakers. Sure. Oh, picture. Did you join them? Okay. Thank you. Sorry? Sure. Thank you.